the other thing I put out, it suggests is that marriage is taught but also caught. And I think that modeling aspect is really, really important. People need to see it.
Andrea Mrożek and Peter John Mitchell, it's such a joy to talk to you. I've been bursting to speak to you ever since I came across your book on marriage. I do, which I have to admit to my chagrin now that when I first came across the book, I thought, oh, another book on marriage, kind of. Brad Wilcox has done Get Married, and it's all there. What else is this book going to say? But actually, I was so pleasantly surprised, and I was wrong to kind of think, oh, and roll my eyes. It's a brilliant book, and it really makes a substantive contribution, and that's why I'm so pleased you were gracious enough, both of you, to come and talk to me about it, and really that we can explore it together, and hopefully encourage lots of other people to go and read it, because it's got some valuable stuff in it. Before we start, I don't know, both of you, either of you, what prompted you to get into writing this book?
So for my part, I think it was we've worked on marriage and family issues here in Canada for almost 20 years. And I think at some point we realized we're accruing knowledge about marriage that is almost a secret from the general population. My entry point into thinking about marriage was through this public policy space and through academic research. And it really appeared to me then that many people outside of religious spaces never give a second thought to marriage. And so at some point, I think we both realized, and we have been longtime colleagues, that this information should not be a secret, especially from the next generation. But I don't know if Peter John, you have your own reasons.
Yeah, I think very similar reasons as well. And Tony, I was even thinking about, in all these years of doing marriage research, what would I want my kids to understand about marriage, about its value, not only to them as individuals, but also to the public, why it's good for society. And so thinking about how do we construct sort of that presentation, how do we make that argument? And I would be here. We're both Canadians, and in our sort of Canadian culture, and I assume it's similar in the UK. Marriage is largely viewed as nice but unnecessary, and so there really is. Obviously, I think in some circles there's hostility to marriage, but in general, people think it's kind of a nice choice. But it's just one choice among many, and there's really no sort of sense that. Its meaning, I think we've lost a little bit of that logic to why marriage, and a little bit of the language around it too has kind of lost its meaning. And so we're trying to recapture that in some sense.
Great, and that aspect of it being Canada. It's Canada-centered in a lot of the data, but in a lot of the logic and a lot of the arguments, of course, it's much more applicable and much more widely than Canada. But that's by no means the least, but a very significant contribution, if you like, in that it's opening the debate, opening the discussion from a Canadian perspective, which very much needs to be done. I want to discuss a few aspects of the book with you, and just to get your mental juices flowing, I want to talk about the public good that you mentioned in the book. I want to talk about the two cultural models that you talk about. I want to talk about the thing which I've read Mark Regnerus on, the kind of cornerstone versus capstone discussion, which is fascinating that people want to talk about, and then maybe just some questions that just to test some of the things you've been putting forward in the book. First of all, the kind of public good nature that you raise about marriage. So what do you think people need to learn about marriage being a public good?
Unfortunately, maybe where we see this is where marriage is absent, and in the book, we do talk a little bit about some of the broader social issues that are very troubling. But from my perspective, very little public conversation is spent looking at how these relate back to family structure. And I think one of the important aspects of marriage and its contribution to society is that it still remains the most stable family form. And there's just tremendous benefit of having a mom and dad linked together and then both involved in the life of their children. And we see that in the social sciences. We see that marriage is good for men and women, and I think especially for children. I think the evidence is quite robust for the advantages for children who grew up in married parent homes tend to enjoy higher levels of educational attainment, less risk behavior. We've done some work actually a number of years ago looking at longitudinal data showing that there's even a significant difference between children that grew up in cohabiting families versus married families. And though I think this plays out to the bigger societal kind of picture when we see the stability, it flows outward, and families really are that building block of society. And so I think, not everyone needs to get married, but I do think you need kind of a healthy sort of core of family stability for a stable culture.
Also, to add that there's a public side to marriage that we're simply not embracing, again, how marriage contributes to social stability in ways that are very obvious. There seems to be something of an allergy to discussing marriage as a policy issue. And so there's two examples I'd cite there. And one would be income inequality, which was sort of a raging discussion not too long ago, at least in Canada. And income inequality is a concern, and then it's very much linked to family structure as our poverty levels. But nobody raises marriage as an issue, and the key scholars on that are sort of hesitant, I think, to dive into something that they view as perhaps being judgmental or moralistic. The second area I'd say is child welfare, and when you have children who are being cared for by children's aid societies or as part of the child welfare system, there'll be a whole slew of training courses to try and help. Most of it is very admirable, but there's this gaping hole insofar as that relationships are never addressed in a fulsome way, and the idea that marriage might provide stability even in those circumstances for low-income single parents. It's this type of gap that we want to have the conversation re-engage, because those are public issues. They should be of concern to each one of us, and we don't talk about family where it matters most in that sense.
And it's really interesting because there's a stat we often talk about that here in the UK, 90% of the richest mums are married, only 20% of the poorest mums are married. So when it comes to social mobility, when it comes to all those benefits that you've highlighted that marriage brings above and beyond cohabitation, above and beyond just living with somebody, the idea there's something about the publicly declared long-term commitments that it's not just a piece of paper, there's something more to it, and the stats bear that out. When it comes to all those benefits in terms of health, in terms of mental health, in terms of financial well-being, in terms of academic performance, in terms of lack of involvement with the criminal justice system, all you could go on and on and on, and they're not marginal benefits, they're statistically very significant differences. When it comes to all those things, it's kind of the elite people that are doing it more these days to the cost and if you like, not talking the walk that they themselves walk, but actually speaking something else, and then the people at the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum aren't enjoying the benefits. But quick question for you on that front. A lot of people will say, well, correlation and causation, they're very different things, and actually more responsible people are more likely to get married, and it has ever been thus, and it wouldn't make any difference for the less responsible people if they're married anyway. How would you respond to that?
And our sort of answer in the book is there's probably a little bit of both that going on. I can certainly see studies have shown that even children in lower income families, when there's two parents there, when they're married parents, tend to have higher outcomes in terms of education. We've seen certainly with lower skilled men who get married tend to be more productive economically than their peers who are unmarried, and even in some cases it's been shown more productive than men, maybe slightly more skilled in the workforce than themselves. So yep. I think there's certainly evidence that there's something about marriage that sort of draws the best out of men in particular. I'm thinking in terms of that productivity as an example, and in some ways, I think it could be a little bit of both. But I would certainly push back the idea that it's simply just people who with a certain skill set or a certain kind of capacity opting into marriage. I don't think it's just that.
No, you're right, and the stats absolutely right, Peter John. They bear that out very, very well. That marriage civilizes men, and when you remove the whole kind of socioeconomic spectrum, you take that element out of the data. Marriage does civilize men. Men improve when they're married. They're better. They work harder. They want to provide for their family. Generally speaking, and of course, this is always a population view, if you like, and there will always be examples on either side of the fence where things are very, very different. But on a population level, men are better when they're married. Growing up with your married mum and dad, biological mum and dad, gives you the absolute best chance in life statistically beyond any other relationship type or any other situation, and it's a clear advantage. And those are the stats. It's not it may also be a kind of moral imperative, but actually from a statistical point of view is very, very obvious. So you make that point very, very clearly in the book, and that's great, and it's great for Canada to realise that. But you move on to other things which are just as equally, if not more profound. You talk about the cultural models for marriage, and you talk about two different cultural models and how we've seen a change over the years and why that's different and why that matters. Does one of you want to elaborate upon that for me?
That would be the soulmate model and the institutional model of marriage. I did want to just add in response to your earlier question there that we're so early on in our culture. We've lost a marriage culture. We don't have it. The upper income levels are engaging in it and talking about it. But amongst lower income people, I mean, I kind of understand the hesitancy because you don't want to waltz into somebody's home who's struggling and is a low income single parent and perhaps involved with the child welfare services as well, and say, like, if you got married, your problems would be solved. And that's a little bit, I think, of how it gets interpreted, this type of discussion. But I can say through my work with low income single mothers involved with the child welfare system that they don't even have a vocabulary. Marriage is simply not part of it. And in much the way that some of the upper income levels will be married but talk about having a partner, I've noticed at the lower income levels, some of these women will talk about somebody having a husband, and you think, oh, that's strange, they got married, how unusual, how great for them. And it turns out they didn't get married, but they're using this word that they know from, somewhere, to talk about a cohabiting relationship. We do spend a lot of time in the book to address the soulmate model, talking about how we have never known in an institutional model of marriage in our lifetime, certainly not being born in the 70s as I am. The soulmate model has really taken over, and that's the idea of marriage or relationships, like the relationship, the loving, romantic, you complete me, cue the sort of Hollywood music, that type of approach to marriage has really been the dominant way of thinking about marriage. There's the book by Stephanie Coontz, Love Conquered Marriage, and that's very much true. And our point is not that love is not a part of marriage, but that there is more to marriage than just a loving relationship. And certainly more, one should think of marriage as more of like a Tolkien type adventure rather than a rom-com. So when you got your entertainment on a Friday night, if you're going to ponder our marriage book, then marriage, we're presenting it as something of more of an adventure. The long-term nature of it, not just about love, but also about social stability, also about other factors, financial and spiritual, and union in all types of ways, sexual, financial, spiritual, union. Marriage is much more than just a loving relationship. But we lack a vocabulary to even talk about this fully, I freely confess, because it's hard to pitch an institutional model of marriage when you have never known it. And I'd argue that since we had the no-fault divorce revolution, then that was kind of the death knell for institutional marriage, and that's why we haven't known it.
Yeah. I mean, we could have a whole conversation about no-fault divorce and the impact that's had on marriage and the culture more generally. Is an absolute travesty. But it's interesting. I've recently come back from Vietnam, which does have much more of an institutional model of marriage. So they've got a very 0.2% divorce rate. I think it's joint second lowest in the world or something. Very, very low. Things are beginning to change with Western influence and Hollywood, I might add, as you mentioned. But it's very interesting how you point out in the book, and you come with your receipts as well. It's not just your opinion. You point out how these things have changed over time, and how people's marriage is based on their feelings, and it's almost like your regular supermarket. If for some reason you don't like your regular supermarket, just change it. If for some reason you're no longer getting on with your partner for whatever reason, well, just change them and divorce and find another one. What's wrong with that attitude? Why shouldn't we do that?
Yeah, I think the soulmate model of marriage is hyper individualistic. And so it really is about, like, how does this serve me at this time? And I think one of the reasons why it contributes to instability is that it's putting tremendous pressure on the other person to fulfill or to complete something that you feel is lacking or that you need to gain. Whereas I think that institutional model is you're sort of entering together into something. There's a little bit of self-limiting for the greater good of the things that you want to achieve as a couple for growing that family. And so I think that instability, that sort of changing out partners that we see so prevalent, in part thanks to no fault divorce culture, it really does create that instability, and it's not good for men or women. We know it's not good for your finances for sure, but lots of evidence too that it's not great for kids. And certainly, as we point out in the book, there are instances where marriages can do nothing but end in divorce, where there's abuse, but I think this kind of a hyper individualistic approach to marriage has not really served us well. I think overall, and I'm not sure that it's made people happier. I don't think it really has.
I actually argue strenuously that, once upon a time we may have lived with too many social constraints around relationship. And then the sexual revolution came. Let's date that to somewhere in the 60s. And now the problem for young people today is the exact opposite. It's not too much constraint. It is too little. And so for young people today, and again, I'd stress sort of, we don't know this social stability of marriage if you're born in the 70s or after. Today we're floundering in a sea of choices and endless choices and no constraint, and we're trying to identify how to do relationship once again. Dating culture is in shambles. It's, to get married for many people is a stretch, really. If you can't, figure out how to go on a date, then that's a first order problem. So it's really not, it's a sort of, if people are going to accuse us of being too conservative, I think they're living in an era where we are not generally there. And to talk to young people today, I don't think you're going to find that the constraints of marriage were their main problem,
Statistically, the happiest people in the world are married with children. Yep. And that's just a fact. Again, that's not a value judgment. It's just a statistical fact with surveys of people done from all over the world. That's just a fact. And the other thing, so from my personal experience being married for 30 years, there have been times when the thing that has kept us together is the promise that we would stay together. And I've said this before. After 30 years of marriage, I can honestly say our marriage is better in every way than it's ever been. And I know my wife would agree with me there. But that's born of struggle and commitment and just sticking at it and working through the tough times and the difficult situations and getting to a point where, okay, right, we can really enjoy this now in a way that maybe, the struggles would have stopped us from doing had we not had that commitment. And I think the point you're making is, in the book, that a lot of people just don't have that staying power. As soon as it gets a bit rough, well, I'm off, without realizing that it's the struggle that makes you stronger and makes you better.
Well, if you've been taught and coached into the zone of love and, a sense of feelings as being the mainstay of a marriage, and then those dissipate or change, and it could even be, let's face it, a rough patch in a marriage might be even years. That's certainly no fun. The commitment needs to be present on both sides to fight through that. But absent the idea of longevity in marriage, a concern I would have that people enter into marriage a little too easily. So all of the research we're talking about is the result of a good marriage, which can be your making, and a bad marriage might be your undoing. And so we really need to take this sort of question of who we marry very seriously. But if you can get out of something easily, then perhaps how you enter into it might be done with a bit less caution.
And the pre-marriage stuff is so important, and it's not focused on at all anywhere ever. But also the post-marriage counselling there's hardly any of it available anywhere ever. And it's almost like there's something wrong with you if you go for marriage counselling. Not at all. And I think there's work to be done in all of our countries, really, to just provide facilities whereby people have the time to sit down and chat through things, especially if they've not done the pre-marriage stuff.
Yeah, it's so hard to find marriage counselors, and the look on people's faces when you ask around is kind of like, oh, sorry, like it's a shameful thing. Whereas I think it should be the number you keep on your fridge next to the mechanic. Like, you don't buy a car and think you're never going to have to get it checked and it's going to run smoothly. So, the day you...
I love that analogy, and it's so true. Yeah. You don't go for an MOT, because you think your car's broken. You do it because you want to make sure your car's working to its best ability, and that's absolutely right. And the whole point of marriage counselling, if anyone's listening and thinking, oh, it's not for us, the whole point of it is to allow you the space and the framework to talk about things that you might not have opportunity to talk about. And that's all. And it could be trivial, or it could be less than trivial, or more than serious, whatever you want it to be. But it just gives you that space and that framework. And everyone needs that. And it's really good and really, really healthy. So that's that, and you deal with that really, really well, I think, in the book, highlighting those two models and the throwaway culture, which has kind of been brought into marriage, that if you just don't like it, just change it and don't bother sticking with anything which is even slightly difficult. So you deal with that really well. And the message would be that the best is yet to come where marriage is concerned. You know, the struggles are worth it. And with effort comes growth and benefit. It really, really does. You talk really interestingly, and I know Mark Regnerus picks up this issue of cornerstone and capstone marriage, but he looks at it from a religious perspective. And your book, like our organisation, we have people interested from all faiths and none. A lot of Christians, some people from other faiths, and I regularly interact with people that have no faith, but they look at marriage and see, it's a good model for society. We need to keep that. But you talk about the capstone versus cornerstone attitude towards marriage. Explain to us what that stuff means and why changes come about.
Yeah, so if you looked at perhaps my parents' generation, it wasn't uncommon to get married in your early 20s. And then to start building life together, careers, perhaps home, then children. And so marriage really served as this foundation for which to build a life together. Well, I think we've seen that flip now, where these other pieces, couples feel or individuals feel they need to get these pieces in place. We're in school longer to get more education. People want to get feel financially kind of solid before entering marriage, perhaps own property or even have kids before getting married. And marriage really becomes this capstone. It becomes sort of a symbol that we have arrived. We have pulled all these things together, and now we're ready to kind of move on with this next phase of life. And that certainly has meant marrying at older ages. But I think it also contributes to something that you had mentioned earlier, Tony, is that if those other pieces of life seem out of reach, then you are not going to get to the capstone part of marriage. And I think that's one of the contributing factors to this marriage gap between more people with higher educational attainments, perhaps higher incomes, versus those with less educational attainment and perhaps lower incomes. I think this has really kind of contributed to that. But again, I think this is part of that soulmate model of marriage, where again it is a completion of something, it is a symbol of something. And I think we even see it in what I sometimes jokingly call the marriage industrial complex, where these big expensive weddings that are very individually focused or self-focused, that again is about sort of individual sort of celebration rather than entering into sort of this storied institution. So it really has flipped the script, and I think it has implications not only for that marriage gap, but even things like fertility and those kinds of issues as well.
Yeah, I looked the other day, and the average age of first-time fatherhood in the UK is now 33.8 years. Oh my goodness, and I think it's just over 30 for women. And you think, well, that doesn't give you much chance. No wonder our replacement birth rate is 1.44. It doesn't really give you much chance to have children, if at all.
Yeah, and yet some people might be thinking that sounds really young. 30. Yeah. Honestly, right. That's how the script has flipped. And life script is something, that we refer to as a way of established way of living and how you pursue your life. That used to be known as finish school, get married, finish school, get married, have kids in that order. And we really,
in that order. Yeah, that's right.
It's not really evident that you should do anything. It's that endless sea of choices, which has a good side, but has gone way too far and has left people behind, insofar as Peter John's already talked about how if you have a view of marriage as it being the pinnacle of success and you don't think you're successful, then you've just lost out on one of the good things of life, because it's not going to come your way. And
one of the most practical things of life as well. So many young people, I fortunately get to travel all over the country and sometimes around the world and talk to thousands of our supporters. And some of the young people I talk to, some of them say we can't afford to get married. And you think, how can you afford not to? You know, the idea that you're sharing rent between the two of you, the idea that you share all the bills between, what's not to do? You know, what do you mean you can't afford to get married? It doesn't make any sense.
Is that the view of the marriage celebration as being extremely costly, like to do it right? Because I've met that many times over the years, like, and even fell prey to it a little bit. I'd like to think we had a modest marriage with my husband, but it was still expensive in the grand scheme of budgeting items.
And it kind of brings us onto the if you like, the outlying approach of your book, which is, look, we need to look at marriage from the point of view, not just a policy angle, because that's like almost a busted flush, but from a cultural angle. How do we reintegrate marriage culturally? Now, I know you've approached this from a very a laudable secular evidence base, in the same way that our organisation works, but how do we persuade a culture which is hooked on this romantic aspect of marriage and massive weddings, and how do we get back to the fact that this is something which is an intergenerational, institutional, commendable, wonderful thing that you should engage with earlier rather than later? And where on earth do we start?
We certainly have a lot of work to do to switch the culture. Sadly, I think some of the pain from the way we've lived out our relationship lives to this point will lead people to seek different answers, because it has been a tough haul. The relationship between the sexes is fairly divisive and broken now. It needs to be repaired. As we've promoted this book, that's probably been the top thing to come up, is that men and women want different things these days, and how can that gap be bridged? So it's come up far more than I thought it would, actually, which indicates to me that for young people today, that's a real problem. I certainly think there's a lot of hope and a lot of openness to the message. I think the main barrier where we live would be the educational establishment, which proceeds in some fairly poorly thought out sex ed curricula, for example, or relationship discussions that aren't friendly to healthy relationships, and that will be a tough nut to crack. But as we, certainly it's not a political discussion. The politics will be the last thing to ever broach it. My desire for, income inequality discussions to include marriage, etc., it may happen, but the politics will be the last thing to follow the culture after it already shifts. So I think we have other suggestions in the book. Certainly the decline in religiosity has not helped marriage at all. So it's not a religious issue. We don't approach it as such, but it is also a religious issue. And we know that people who are religious are more likely to get married and more likely to pursue marriage as a goal and do premarital counseling, etc. So I think, we have our work cut out for us, really. What am I missing from the book there, Peter John?
Yeah, I guess the other thing that I put out it suggests is that marriage is taught but also caught, and I think that modeling aspect is really, really important.
Yeah.
People need to see it, and I think in communities where marriage has disappeared or disappearing, I think it's a real challenge to talk about marriage unless people can kind of see these healthy, functioning marriage as they really are. That there are struggles, that there are ups, there are downs, and again, I think this is another reason why religious communities do matter, because they value marriage. There's marriages to be observed there. There are older couples that can model that to younger couples. And we're even seeing marriage preparation move to not simply just sort of the course model, but also to a model, mentorship model as well, which I think is a really healthy move. So it is difficult cultural work, but I think I too I'm hopeful. I think the bad fruit of the sexual revolution is coming to bear, and I think people are kind of fed up. I think they're looking for something more. I think we're even seeing that in more, I would say, like secular authors are questioning the sexual revolution, are suggesting that maybe marriage is good for women. Maybe it is good for men. We're seeing that.
Oh, absolutely. We often talk about Louise Perry, who's done just that thing. She Case Against Sexual Revolution, one of our leading feminists. And her conclusion is the best thing a woman can do is find a husband and get married and stay married.
Yeah, I understand she's also doing actual meetups to bring people together.
Again, that was, I happen to be a Christian myself, but religion aside, that was one of the big values of churches, that you kind of had a community of people who felt the same way that you did about lots of stuff, and you were much more likely to get on with them and whatever else. And those communities have been lost as we've moved online. You'd think it would be easier to find communities, but actually no, everyone's pretending to be something they're not. It's all homogenized. Nobody knows who they are or who anything is anymore. Nobody can communicate. As you said, dating is like, goodness knows how to do that anymore, let alone get married. We don't even know the values that contribute to marriage, things like honor, things like commitment. What do those words even mean anymore? We've got no idea. The young people are never taught anything about that. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of work to do.
Meeting disembodied people on dating apps where you have to situate them and figure out whether they have any link to your community, and if not, and are they a safe person? Are they who they say they are? I think, there's been tons written, and we don't actually talk too much about dating culture in the book, really focusing on the issue, pushing and pulling at marriage and asking people to ask those questions. But the dating culture in shambles is something that we are well aware of. Anyways, I feel like I have great sympathy for people who find themselves stuck because there aren't that many opportunities to meet, marriageable people. And the online world, with it being disembodied, and that feels rather unsafe for many. It's not the ideal, and it hasn't helped as we see the marriage data. When we got all these apps, it's not like the marriage rate skyrocketed.
While you don't, your book, and one of the really outstanding points about your book is you don't focus on a policy emphasis, if you like. You focus on the whole kind of cultural need to reinvent marriage culturally. What is there nonetheless? I mean, do you think there are any policy initiatives that would help in terms of? You mentioned earlier on that it's almost like we don't want to interfere with people's private lives as far as the government thinks, yet we're happy to talk about food, and we're happy to say, look, these foods are good to eat, and it doesn't mean we're going to prejudice you if you are overweight, but actually we know that being overweight sometimes leads to other conditions, and why don't you eat these foods instead of those foods? We're happy to talk about that, but when it comes to relationships and things which have a much more profound and significant effect on our lives, it's like, oh, no, government won't go near it. But I'm wondering if they were to be brave enough, or if you were to have 5 minutes with a policy maker, what would your pitch be?
Yeah, I think at the very least, I would recommend that government remove barriers to marriage, and where some of the places where we see that would be in our benefits programs or perhaps our tax programs. And so in my extended family, we know people who were together and delayed getting married for almost a decade because the clawback on disability benefits for the one partner was going to be so severe that it didn't make economic sense to get married. And I think that kind of thing should be identified and fixed. And at the very minimum, I think that's a policy action that governments could take.
And I agree with that. It's exactly the same over here. That the state is often the father and the partner, because it punishes you financially if you move in with the actual father or the partner, and we've got to find a way of not penalising single mothers, and the majority are single mothers, yet not discouraging marriage and mums and dads living together with their biological children, because that's the last thing you want to discourage.
Mm-hmm. Even asking the question, and that is the approach we take, is to ask tons of questions about what you thought you knew about marriage in this book. That's our approach. But policymakers could do that as well. And what do they think they know about marriage, and where could it possibly help? And placing marriage back on the dashboard, as it were, as a choice.
Yeah, great. Have I missed anything from your great book that you're thinking, why hasn't he asked me about that?
No, you've covered a lot of things, and appreciate your enthusiasm for the book. I think that as Canadians, you mentioned Brad Wilcox has written Get Married. So a Canadian approach is more like, hey, have you thought about this? It's lighter. And, it brings to bear a lot of similar data, but allows people that space to not be dogmatic. And really another reason for writing the book was to take a lot of the heat out, because it shouldn't be that marriage is a very controversial thing to talk about, but it actually is. And so the hope is that we take that heat out and we allow people to consider and just shine a bit of light on different aspects of marriage that people today are generally not considering.
Yeah, well, listen, I read your book, and before I read it, I was kind of a bit, another one, because I read an awful lot. I read everything, and I was surprised at how good it was, at how encouraged I was, how excited I was reading it. It was a really, really good read. It's well written. It's full of lots of useful information. It's short enough for anyone to pick it up and read the chapters, and I really would commend it for people to get and read and pass on to somebody else, pass on to some young people, give them the book and say, just read this. And like you say, that lovely Canadian approach, see what you think. It's very, very nice. So well done, both. Well done, Andrea. Well done, Peter John. And thank you so much both for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.